Well, hello xenographers everywhere and welcome to another episode. There are lots of vintage 50mm lenses available. Some are nice and some are really nice, but there aren't that many that are quite as nice as this, the Zeiss Jena 50mm f1.8 Pancolar. This is one of those former Eastern Bloc lenses that were once fairly commonplace and a little bit lacking in cachet compared to Western lenses of the time, but which have now developed something of a cult following. There's a great deal of praise for this lens online, so I was quite keen to find out how well it would perform. I've found build quality to be very good on these Zeiss Jena lenses and generally on a par with many Western lenses of the time. They're a little bit better built and finished than other former Eastern Bloc lenses like the Jupiters, Feds and Helioses for example, and they're closer to Western lenses in that respect, but they do seem to need servicing more often. Apertures can get sticky and grease can dry out. I seem to have got lucky with this one though, and everything seems to be in reasonably good order. The focus rings at the front of the lens and it turns nicely and smoothly. It falls easily to hand with the camera to your eye and it has a knurled rubber surface, so it's easy to grip. It does extend a little at minimum focus distance, about a centimetre in this case, as these Zeiss Jena lenses often do. The aperture rings at the back and it too is nice and easy to turn, perhaps a little too easy. The clicks aren't quite as defined as they are on my other Zeiss Jena lenses, so I think this one may have been apart in the past and not quite reassembled correctly. But the aperture works fine, so it's no real problem. Some of these Pancolars, from the mid-60s or thereabouts, are radioactive, but this one dates, I think, from the late 70s or the 80s sometime, so there's no Geiger counteraction going on here. Zeiss Jena lenses usually have very nice colour rendition, and this one's no exception. Colours from this lens are absolutely stunning, just beautiful. They're rich, vivid and punchy, but not oversaturated, with a wonderful depth. Some lenses give colours that are a little bit weak and washed out, but not this one. Colours from this lens just jump out at you, and it's one of the nicest I've used in this regard. In terms of colour, it has a character all its own, a certain indefinable something that amounts to a little bit of magic. It's a pretty contrasty lens, so it makes great black and white images too, with a richness and a depth that I really like. It's got fantastic tonal range and, I think, has something of a filmy look. Blacks are rich and deep, whites are bright without being garish or overwhelming, and shades of grey have a hint of silver in them, a little bit of sparkle that really works well. If you like your lenses sharp, this one will not disappoint. It's very sharp indeed, and I was surprised by the amount of fine detail it can resolve. Even at a fairly long distance, you can see almost every leaf on this tree. As usual, all these images were shot wide open, so it can only get better as you stop down. I think this is one of the sharpest vintage lenses I've used. The Pentax 50mm f4 macro is sharper, but not by much. There is quite a bit of flare with this lens if the sun's in the frame, and in those conditions it loses a little contrast, but not much, and that's testament to the quality of the coatings applied to the lens. I quite like a bit of flare myself, but if that's not your thing, it's best used with a hood. If you stop right down, you can make some very cool six-pointed sun stars, and it makes some really nice hexagonal flare, coloured purple, because of the purple coatings. Many of these Zeiss Jena lenses have a pretty small minimum focus distance. It seems to have been part of the design philosophy, and I think that's a really great feature. I do like close-up photography, and this one goes down to 35 centimeters. It's by no means a macro lens, but it's a nice feature to have as it makes the lens that bit more versatile. Shooting close means shallow depth of field, which of course means plenty of background blur, and again this lens is consistent with the other Zeiss Jena lenses I've used in that blur is very nice indeed. It's very soft and very smooth, and close to the subject it's there in abundance. It gives a beautiful feel to a shot, and I don't think that word's out of place here. Zeiss Jena lenses have some of the most aesthetically pleasing blur I've seen. The softness of this blur is almost tangible. You really can almost feel it. Just lovely. That wonderful blur decreases with distance, of course, but the fairly wide f1.8 aperture means it's still there at 5 to 6 feet or so. It's not soft all the way though, and blur in the medium background can turn a little bit harsh, a little bit busy. There is an unsweet spot with this lens that seems to emerge when straight lines are present. It doesn't bother me too much, and it's easy enough to shoot around if you don't like it. If you like swirly blur in the back of a shot, this lens will generate it, but not quite as much as some other lenses do. As I understand it, it's derived from the Zeiss Biotar design, but was re-engineered in, I think, the 1950s, when much of the swirl was engineered out. Swirl from this lens is more delicate, more restrained, less in your face than swirl from, say, the Helios 44. It's actually really nice, and I think there are times when the more subtle swirl that this lens creates is nicer than that from the Helios, which on occasion can be a little bit overwhelming. Point light sources in the back of a shot will generate bubbles, and the nearer you are to the subject, the bigger they become. Like most vintage lenses, bubbles are circular in the center and they become elliptical towards the edges. On this lens, however, they change to ellipses only a very short distance out from the center, and that I think betrays the lens's Biotar origins and accounts for the slight swirl it can give under the right conditions. Wide open, they're nice and round, and if you stop down to around f4 or so, they become hexagonal. While that's not everyone's cup of tea, personally, I rather like it. I think it adds a little bit of sparkle, a signature look. And that's what I'm really looking for in a vintage lens. A bit of character, a little bit of magic. If you don't like ninja stars though, you should probably avoid f2 to f4 because this lens does create them around that aperture range. Personally, I must admit that I'm not that keen at all, and while it's true that they do lend a little bit of character, I find them to be rather harsh and unappealing. For me, it's definitely a case of hexagons good, ninja stars bad. So, does this lens live up to its reputation? For me, the answer has to be yes. It's got fantastic colour rendition. It makes some beautifully soft background blur. Its minimum focus distance is a useful 35 centimeters on full frame. It's very well made and finished, and it's quite a good looking lens too. A good example of this lens costs about £100, so it's not particularly cheap, and there are other vintage 50mm that are quite a bit cheaper. Given what this one can do though, I'd say it's worth it. So that's it from me for now. As ever, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe and ring the bell before you go, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.